Soldiers, sailors, and airmen of the Allied Expeditionary Force, you are about to embark upon the great crusade toward which we have striven these many months. The eyes of the world are upon you.
On June 6, 1944, as the first light of dawn broke over the stormy waters of the English Channel, the immense force of the Allied invasion became unmistakably real. Thousands of landing craft, braving treacherous seas and unpredictable weather, advanced steadily toward the Normandy coast. Each craft, whether a small, nimble vessel or a larger, heavily loaded transport, was a critical component of an operation that mobilized over 7,000 ships. This colossal armada was not merely a collection of boats. It represented the organized, meticulously planned might of an entire coalition. Every landing craft carried soldiers, armored vehicles, and vital supplies, and its progression signified the beginning of an assault that would determine the future of a continent. Among the many who embarked on these craft was John Roman, a member of the 4th Infantry Division, whose personal account brings an intimate dimension to this vast military enterprise. Roman remembered the deafening roar of the engines as his landing craft cut through the choppy waters, the palpable tension among his comrades, and the overwhelming realization that each wave of soldiers stepping ashore was part of a larger, historic effort. His recollections detail the raw emotion of that moment, the mixture of fear, determination, and a profound sense of duty. For Roman, every heartbeat on that day carried the weight of responsibility, as he and his fellow soldiers not only fought for their lives, but also for the liberation of an entire Europe from the clutches of tyranny. The stakes of this operation were monumental. The decision to launch an invasion with an armada of 7,000 ships was not taken lightly. It was an act born of desperate necessity and bold conviction. Each of these vessels was a vessel of hope and determination, carrying not just troops, but also the future of freedom for millions. In this single, coordinated effort, the fate of Europe was placed on a knife's edge. The outcome of the landing had the power to reshape the course of the war. A success would pave the way for the ultimate defeat of Nazi forces, while failure could have prolonged the conflict and cast a dark shadow over the liberation of an entire continent. This narrative is not merely a recounting of military logistics or a tally of impressive numbers. It is a tribute to the extraordinary courage and sacrifice of every individual who took part in this historic day. It is the story of how an unprecedented naval invasion, marked by the determined advance of thousands of landing craft and the indomitable spirit of soldiers like John Roman, set in motion the events that would lead to the downfall of tyranny and the restoration of freedom across Europe. On a hot July day in 1943, London was under constant attack. Above ground, the city trembled with the sound of enemy bombers and air raids, filling the streets with fear and uncertainty. Yet, deep beneath the chaos, a secret underground bunker offered safety and a place for careful planning, a quiet space where Britain's leaders could work in peace. Inside this hidden network, known as the Cabinet War Rooms, every wall and table had a clear purpose. Officers gathered here to spread out maps, study intelligence reports, and plan each move with precision. Every detail mattered, from tracking enemy movements to organizing supply lines. In these quiet, fortified rooms, important decisions were made that would eventually lead to a turning point in the war. At the heart of this command center was Winston Churchill. He had his own personal war room, a private space within the bunker where he could work without distractions. In that simple room, Churchill read daily reports, listened to advice from his most trusted officers, and made bold decisions that carried the weight of a nation. His clear and steady leadership brought hope and direction at a time when every decision was crucial. Churchill's war room was more than just a private office. It was a hub of focus and determination. Every conversation and every map spread on the table helped shape the strategy for the coming battles. Military planners worked day and night to review fresh intelligence and refine plans that could lead to victory. Every piece of information was discussed carefully, as the fate of millions rested on these decisions. Deep in that underground bunker, away from the bombed-out streets of London, Britain's leaders built a strong and clear plan. They knew that success depended on every decision, no matter how small it seemed. The bunker was a place where ideas were tested and turned into plans that later paved the way for the D-Day invasion. Even as the city above suffered, in those secret rooms a quiet resolve was growing, one that would eventually help free Europe from tyranny. This story of the bunker shows how a hidden, simple place under London became the center of strategic thinking during one of history's darkest times. In that underground refuge, every map, every report, and every meeting were a step toward victory. Churchill's steady hand and the careful work of his team turned uncertainty into a clear plan. Their work not only helped protect Britain, but also laid the groundwork for a future of freedom and hope for millions around the world. By 1943, Nazi Germany's dominance over Europe appeared unbreakable. Hitler's forces stretched from the Atlantic coast to the Soviet Union, where the bloodiest land battles in history raged. The Eastern Front consumed millions of lives, and Stalin's Red Army teetered on the brink of collapse. Meanwhile, Britain stood isolated, a defiant but vulnerable island amid the storm. The Allies faced a dire truth. If the Soviet Union fell, Hitler's war machine would pivot west, unopposed and unstoppable. Churchill knew a direct confrontation with Nazi power required more than brute force. The Atlantic Wall, a labyrinth of bunkers, mines and artillery, lined Hitler's European fortress. Any invasion risked catastrophic losses unless the Allies could outthink the enemy. The solution? A plan so audacious it hinged on two pillars: a massive amphibious assault and a deception campaign so convincing it would rewrite the course of the war. Lieutenant General Frederick Morgan, appointed Chief of Staff to the Supreme Allied Commander in early 1943, became the principal architect of Operation Overlord. His meticulous planning addressed every detail, from troop logistics to the precise timing of the invasion. Yet uncertainty lingered. Weather delays and the sheer scale of coordination pushed the Allies to their limits. General Dwight Eisenhower, who took command of Operation Overlord on January 1, 1944, faced immense pressure to balance readiness with secrecy. By early 1944, the stage was set. Churchill and the Allied command committed to a risky gamble, a cross-channel invasion on June 6, 1944. Over 150,000 troops, 5,000 ships and 11,000 aircraft prepared to storm 5 beaches in Normandy. The plan relied on precision, secrecy, and the element of surprise. Failure meant annihilation. Success would crack Hitler's empire wide open and ignite the liberation of Europe. The decision to launch was not made lightly. Eisenhower agonized over weather forecasts, postponing the invasion by 24 hours due to storms in the English Channel. When a brief window of calm emerged on June 5, 1944, he gave the fateful order, "Okay, let's go." The Allies advanced into the unknown, carrying the hopes of a world desperate for freedom. By early 1944, the Allies faced a problem as vast as the English Channel itself: how to hide the largest invasion force in history from the eyes of Hitler's spies. The success of D-Day hinged not just on ships and soldiers, but on a shadow war of secrets, a campaign to make the Germans see an army that didn't exist. This was the birth of the Ghost Army, a clandestine unit of artists, engineers, and illusionists, tasked with pulling off one of the greatest deceptions in military history. The mission was clear: create a fake military unit so convincing it would rewrite the map of the war. The Allies needed the Germans to believe the invasion would strike Calais, not Normandy. To do this, they invented the first US Army group, FUSAG, a phantom force led by the famously aggressive General George Patton. But Patton's army was a mirage, a carefully constructed lie built from inflatable tanks, dummy landing craft, and fabricated military hardware. John Bevan, a British intelligence officer and master of deception, spearheaded the effort. Working under the London Controlling Section, Bevan's team orchestrated a ballet of illusion. They deployed rubber tanks that could be inflated in minutes, their canvas hides painted to mimic steel. Plywood aircraft lined fake airfields, while dummy landing craft crowded the shores of Dover, designed to look like an armada preparing to cross the channel. At night, portable speakers blasted the sounds of troop movements and construction, a symphony of noise to fool German listening posts. The deception was meticulous. Every detail mattered. Radio operators sent fake traffic between non-existent divisions, mimicking the chatter of a real army. Double agents fed Berlin false reports of Patton's preparations. Even the location of the decoys was strategic. The FUSAG appeared in southeast England, just across from Calais, while the real invasion force gathered in the southwest, hidden behind hills and camouflage. But the Ghost Army's greatest trick was its psychological warfare. They knew Hitler's paranoia would work in their favor. By making FUSAG seem unstoppable, they played on his fear of a two-front invasion. German reconnaissance planes photographed the inflatable tanks and relayed images to Berlin. Hitler's high command, already stretched thin on the Eastern Front, diverted precious resources, divisions, panzers, and artillery, to Calais, away from the real target. On June 6, 1944, as Allied troops stormed Normandy, the Ghost Army's work reached its climax. German commanders, still convinced the main attack would come at Calais, hesitated to redeploy their forces. Even as reports flooded in from Omaha Beach, Hitler refused to believe Normandy was anything but a diversion. The Ghost Army had done its job. They bought the Allies 48 critical hours, time to secure the beaches and break through Nazi defenses. In the shadowy world of espionage, few stories rival that of Juan Pujol Garcia, a man who played both sides of the deadliest conflict in history, not for glory or greed, but to defy the rise of fascism. His journey from a disillusioned Spanish Civil War veteran to the Allies' most valuable double agent is a tale of audacity, nerve, and a deception so perfect it altered the course of D-Day. Born in Barcelona in 1912, Pujol grew up in a fractured Spain. His early life was marked by idealism. He fought in the Spanish Civil War, 1936-1939, first for the Republicans, then, disgusted by their infighting, briefly for the Nationalists. But the brutality of both sides shattered his faith in ideology. When WWII erupted, Pujol, now a chicken farmer in Madrid, vowed to strike back at fascism in his own way, by becoming a spy. The Abwehr, desperate for agents in Britain, trained him in espionage and codenamed him Alaric. But Pujol had no intention of working for Hitler. Instead, he fled to Lisbon, Portugal, and began feeding the Germans wholly fabricated intelligence, reports so absurd they bordered on farce. The Allies, initially unaware of Pujol's true allegiance, grew alarmed. Who was this mysterious Alaric, sending wild claims about British troop movements? It wasn't until April 1942 that British intelligence, MI5, realized Pujol was working for them. Smuggled to London, he was given the code name Garbo and became the linchpin of the double-cross system, a network of double agents orchestrating Germany's downfall. Garbo's genius lay in his ability to craft lies so elaborate they became believable. He invented a fictional network of 27 sub-agents, dockworkers, soldiers, even a Venezuelan diplomat, all relaying false information to Berlin. His reports were laced with just enough truth to avoid suspicion. For example, he confirmed Allied interest in Norway and Greece, diverting German resources away from Normandy. When the Abwehr sent him microdot cameras and cash rewards, Garbo played the grateful spy, all while building a dossier of German intelligence for MI5. By 1943, Garbo's role in Operation Fortitude, the deception plan to mask D-Day, became critical. He spun a web of falsehoods about General George Patton's Phantom Army, FUSAG, massing in southeast England. Fake radio traffic, inflatable tanks, and staged airfields proved the Allies would strike Calais. Garbo's reports assured Berlin that Normandy was merely a diversion, a ruse to draw German forces away from the real invasion. Hitler swallowed it whole. On June 6, 1944, as Allied troops landed in Normandy, Garbo sent his most dangerous message. He warned the Germans of the invasion, but only after it had already begun. By framing it as a secondary attack, he reinforced Hitler's belief that Calais remained the true target. The result? German reinforcements stayed locked in place while the Allies secured their beachheads. Garbo's deception didn't end with D-Day. For weeks he continued to feed Berlin disinformation, ensuring the Nazis never fully committed their reserves to Normandy. His work earned him the Iron Cross from Germany and an MBE from Britain, making him the only man decorated by both sides. In the spring of 1942, a man with a forged passport and a head full of lies boarded a train from Lisbon to London. His name was Juan Pujol Garcia, a Spanish chicken farmer turned spy, whose audacity would soon make him one of the most unlikely heroes of World War II. But his journey to Great Britain, and into the heart of Allied intelligence, was only the beginning of a deception so intricate, it would baffle even the sharpest minds in Hitler's regime. Pujol's path to Britain began in Madrid, where his initial offer to spy for the British had been dismissed as too risky. Undeterred, he turned to the enemy. He convinced the Abwehr, German intelligence, he was a loyal Nazi sympathizer, eager to infiltrate Britain. They handed him a crash course in espionage, invisible ink, microdot cameras, and a radio transmitter, and sent him to Lisbon with orders to cross into England. But Pujol had no intention of spying for the Germans. In Lisbon, he began crafting his escape. He forged documents, bribed officials, and sent cryptic messages to the British embassy, pleading for asylum. The British, initially skeptical, finally relented. On April 7, 1942, Pujol arrived in London under MI5's protection, codenamed Garbo, a nod to his stellar acting skills. What followed was a masterclass in fabrication. Garbo's mission was to feed the Germans believable lies, but to do that, he needed to know the truth. He spent weeks studying British military manuals, railway timetables, and newspaper archives in London's libraries. He memorized the locations of real army bases, port facilities, and even the schedules of troop trains. But instead of relaying these details to Berlin, he twisted them into elaborate falsehoods. He reported that Allied troops were massing in Scotland, a fabrication he supported by citing observed cargo ships in Glasgow's harbour, which he'd read about in the Times. He claimed American engineers were building decoy airfields in Kent, complete with fake Spitfires, inspired by his tours of rural England. He even invented a fictitious fleet of landing craft in Portsmouth, confirmed by a sub-agent's sighting of inflatables disguised as fishing boats. Garbo's genius lay in his ability to weaponize trivial details. He scoured libraries for obscure facts, a factory's production output, a mayor's speech, a farmer's complaint about military requisitions, and wove them into his reports. To Berlin, these tidbits seemed like gold, specific, actionable, and plausible. Yet they were carefully designed to mislead. When the Abwehr demanded proof, Garbo sent sketches of military installations copied from tourist postcards. By late 1943, Garbo's network of fictional sub-agents had grown to 27 personas, each with their own backstories and sources. There was Dick, a garrulous Dutch airline steward who reported on troop movements in Gibraltar, Stanley, a Welsh nationalist with access to Cardiff's docks, and Mr. Taylor, a retired engineer who observed tank factories in Birmingham. All were lies, but their reports were laced with just enough truth to avoid suspicion. The climax of Garbo's work came with Operation Fortitude, the Allied plan to mask D-Day. Using his library-honed research, he spun a tale of General George Patton's Phantom Army, Fuseg, gathering in southeast England. He cited leaked documents, overheard radio chatter, and even a confidential briefing from a fictional RAF officer to convince Berlin that Calais, not Normandy, was the target. On June 6, 1944, as Allied troops stormed Normandy, Garbo sent his final, most daring message. He informed the Germans of the invasion, but only after it had begun. His report framed it as a diversion, urging them to hold reinforcements in Calais for the main attack. Hitler took the bait, delaying critical panzer divisions for weeks. Garbo's lies had held. June 6, 1944. 2 o'clock hours. The English Channel churned under a moonless sky. Over 150,000 Allied soldiers, piled into landing craft, gliders, and transport planes, braced for a day that would redefine history. This was Operation Overlord, the culmination of years of planning, deception, and sacrifice. But nothing could fully prepare them for what lay ahead. A brutal, chaotic fight against nature, machinery, and a determined enemy. The airborne assault. The night the sky fell. Before dawn, 13,000 American paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions leapt into the blackness over Normandy. Their mission? Seize key bridges, disrupt German reinforcements, and secure the flanks. But gale force winds and anti-aircraft fire scattered the men. Many drowned in flooded fields, weighed down by gear. Others, like Private Joseph Bell, landed miles from their drop zones, alone and disoriented. Simultaneously, 7,000 British and Canadian paratroopers descended near Pegasus Bridge, a critical crossing over the Caen Canal. A handful of glider-borne troops, led by Major John Howard, seized the bridge in a textbook assault, using silenced weapons and bicycles to move swiftly. Their success ensured the Allies could block German counterattacks from the east. The naval invasion, the longest day. By 6:30, the first waves of infantry hit the beaches, codenamed Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. Each became a theater of hell. Utah Beach. Luck favored the Americans here. Strong currents carried the 4th Infantry Division's landing craft 2,000 yards south of their target. Instead of heavily defended sectors, they waded ashore into a relatively quiet zone. By midday, Utah was secured, with fewer than 200 casualties. General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., who landed with the first wave, famously declared, We'll start the war from here. Omaha Beach, just 10 miles east, Omaha became a slaughterhouse. The Germans had fortified the cliffs with 88mm guns, machine gun nests, and barbed wire. Rough seas swamped DD tanks, amphibious Sherman tanks, before they reached shore, leaving infantry exposed. Soldiers like Private Harold Baumgarten faced a wall of steel as they scrambled across 400 yards of open sand. By noon, casualties exceeded 2,000 men. Yet through sheer grit, small groups scaled the cliffs and outflanked the defenses. Omaha held, but barely Gold, Juno, and Sword Beaches. The British and Canadians faced their own nightmares. At Gold, tanks and engineers bulldozed through obstacles, allowing the 50th Division to push inland. At Juno, Canadian troops struggled against submerged mines and fierce resistance, but broke through by afternoon. Sword Beach, though lightly defended, saw the only German armored counterattack of the day, a panzer thrust repelled by British artillery tactical challenges. Everything that could go wrong did. Weather. Eisenhower's gamble on a narrow window of calm seas backfired. Many landing craft capsized, men drowned before firing a shot. Equipment failures. Only 2 of 29 DD tanks reached Omaha's shore. Radios soaked in saltwater failed, severing communication. German resistance. Hitler's 352nd Infantry Division, unexpectedly stationed near Omaha, turned the beach into a killing zone. Critical moments, turning points amid chaos. 7:30. Engineers at Omaha blew gaps in the shingle bank, allowing troops to advance. 9 o'clock. Destroyers like USS Frankfurt closed to 1,000 yards of shore, blasting German positions at point-blank range. 13 o'clock. General Norman Cotter, assistant commander of the 29th Division, rallied men at Omaha. "Gentlemen, we are being killed here. Let's move inland and be killed there." By nightfall, the Allies had secured a tenuous foothold, a 10-mile-wide strip of Normandy. Over 4,400 men lay dead or wounded, and the Germans still held key high ground. Yet the deception had worked. Hitler's generals remained convinced Normandy was a feint, delaying reinforcements for crucial hours. June 7, 1944. As the echoes of battle faded, a new chapter began in the villages and towns surrounding Normandy's beaches. For the first time in 4 years, sunlight broke through the darkness of occupation. Allied soldiers, caked in mud and exhaustion, now encountered the people they'd crossed an ocean to liberate. French civilians, farmers, shopkeepers, children and grandparents, emerging from cellars, attics and shattered homes, blinking in the light of freedom. The first encounters. They brought chocolate and hope. In Sainte-Mère-Église, the first French town liberated by paratroopers of the 82nd Airborne, 12-year-old Marcel Lefebvre peeked out from his family's bakery. He saw American soldiers distributing K-rations and chocolate bars to crowds of starved villagers. "They smiled like we were family," Marcel later recalled. "We hadn't seen sugar in years." The soldiers, many just boys themselves, were stunned by the gratitude. Sergeant John Steele, whose parachute had famously snagged on the town church, wrote home, "These people, they kissed our boots. We didn't feel like heroes, we felt like guests." The warmth of liberation words spread quickly. In Verville-sur-Mer near Omaha Beach, villagers draped bedsheets painted with red, white and blue crosses from windows, a signal to Allied bombers to spare their homes. When GIs arrived, women rushed forward with bottles of cider and bouquets of lilies. "They hugged us like sons," remembered Private Bill Switzer. One old man kept saying, "Merci les Américains, vous êtes nos anges." In Bayeux, the first major town liberated by British forces, crowds cheered as Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery strode through the streets. Children clambered onto tanks, and soldiers handed out Lucky Strike cigarettes to blushing teenagers. But the joy was tempered by loss. Madame Colette Lefebvre wept as she described her husband, killed in a bombing raid the day before. "You came too late for him," she told a Canadian officer, "but maybe not too late for my children." The immediate impact. Life began again. For civilians, liberation meant more than just the absence of Nazis. It meant food, canned meat, powdered milk and flour distributed by the Red Cross. It meant medicine for typhus and tuberculosis, rampant under German rule. And it meant justice. Collaborators were denounced, and resistance heroes like Simone Sigouin, a 19-year-old nurse who'd smuggled weapons, were hailed as legends. But the cost was everywhere. In Caen, where British and Canadian troops fought street by street, 80% of the city lay in ruins. Families camped in fields, their homes reduced to rubble. Yet even there, hope flickered. A French nurse, Geneviève de Gaulle, niece of Charles de Gaulle, wrote, "The people sing as they dig graves. They have seen hell, but they know heaven is possible." Acts of kindness and reckoning. The bond between soldiers and civilians deepened in unexpected ways. In Colleville-sur-Mer, villagers hosted a wedding feast for a GI and a local girl, using flour smuggled from an army field kitchen. In Carentan, a Belgian-American paratrooper, Private Francis Dukowski, was adopted by a widow who cooked him rabbit stew every night, until he was killed in action weeks later. Yet liberation also exposed wounds. Some civilians, embittered by years of betrayal, refused to trust even the Allies. Others turned on neighbors who'd collaborated. In Cherbourg, crowds gathered to watch as women accused of sleeping with German soldiers had their heads shaved, a brutal, cathartic ritual. Legacy of a day. By mid-July 1944, as the Allies broke out of Normandy, the region's civilians began rebuilding. Schools reopened in cellars, and fields once mined were replanted with wheat. But the scars endured. Over 20,000 French civilians died during the Battle of Normandy, and thousands more were displaced. By July 1944, the battlefields of Normandy had shifted eastward, but the war's human toll lingered. Exhausted soldiers, many still trembling from the trauma of D-Day, needed more than food and rest. They needed hope. The Allies responded by transforming French towns into hubs of respite, R&R, rest and recreation camps, where GIs could dance, laugh and forget, if only for a night, the horrors they'd witnessed, the birth of morale boosters. General Dwight Eisenhower understood that victory depended on more than bullets and tanks. A soldier's spirit, he insisted, is his deadliest weapon. Thus, the Special Services Division was born. They requisitioned chateaus, barns and town squares, outfitting them with stages, dance floors and floodlights. In Coubertin, a village near the front, engineers built a sprawling camp with red and white tents, a makeshift baseball diamond, and a bandstand adorned with stars and stripes, orchestras and star power. The camps buzzed with music, swing, jazz and French chansons, played by military bands or local musicians. The USO, United Service Organizations, sent stars like Marlene Dietrich, Bob Hope and Irving Berlin to perform. Dietrich, in her signature deep voice, sang Lily Marlene to crowds of weeping soldiers, while Hope quipped, "If you boys keep this up, we'll be doing shows in Berlin by Christmas." French orchestras like Ray Ventura's Jazz Ensemble joined the fray, blending La Vie en Rose with Glenn Miller's In the Mood. The result was a cultural collision, GIs stomping to swing rhythms while locals marveled at the crazy Americans dancing without partners. Dances, a night without war. The heart of R&R was the dance hall. French women, many widowed or separated from husbands, arrived in their finest dresses made from parachute silk, hair curled with rationed bobby pins. Soldiers, scrubbed of Normandy's mud, fumbled through jitterbug and waltzes, relying on smiles and gestures to bridge language gaps. At Carentan's Liberty Hall, Private Henry Cohen, a Jewish GI from Brooklyn, met Elodie Moreau, a baker's daughter. "She didn't speak English and I butchered French," he later wrote, "but when she laughed, it sounded like church bells." They danced to Moonlight Serenade, and he gave her his last chocolate bar, a moment immortalized in her diary. Cultural exchange, they taught us how to live again. Beyond the dance floors, connections deepened. Soldiers swapped ration cigarettes for lessons in French slang. Young women learned boogie-woogie steps. GIs sampled calvados and snacked on baguettes slathered in canned Spam. In Saint-Lô, a GI named Tommy Tucker organized a softball game, teaching kids to swing bats amid the ruins. "They called it La Balle Ronde," he chuckled. "We called it survival." Tensions and complications. Not all was idyllic. Military police enforced curfews to prevent fraternization with collaborators. Some Frenchmen, resentful of the occupation or jealous of the attention locals gave GIs, grumbled about "les Americans arrogant." Yet even here, humor softened edges. When a GI accidentally knocked over a vase in a farmhouse, he shrugged. "Don't worry, Mom, we'll send you a new one from Sears." Legacy of the dances. By autumn 1944, as the Allies pushed toward Germany, the R&R camps closed, but their impact endured. Over 1 million Allied soldiers had passed through Normandy's towns, forging bonds that transcended war marriages, like that of Elodie and Henry, sprang from those dances. Others, like the friendship between Madame Dubois, a cafe owner, and Sergeant Jack O'Hara lasted decades, letters crossing the Atlantic until their deaths. August 1944. In the ruins of a Norman village, amid the scent of burnt earth and blooming roses, a story began, not of battles or strategies, but of two people who found light in the darkness. This is the tale of John Roman, a 22-year-old GI from Brooklyn, and Jacqueline Rousseau, a 19-year-old French resistance courier. Their love, born in the shadow of war, would become a testament to resilience, a thread of humanity woven into the tapestry of D-Day's legacy. John, a medic with the 2nd Armored Division, first saw Jacqueline on a humid August morning near Vire. His unit had stopped to scavenge supplies from a bombed-out farmhouse. As he stepped inside, a figure emerged from the cellar, a young woman clutching a rifle, her eyes fierce but exhausted. It was Jacqueline, who'd spent weeks guiding Allied troops through minefields and hiding Jewish refugees. "You're either very brave or very stupid," she snapped in broken English, lowering her weapon. John laughed nervously. Maybe both. Their romance unfolded in stolen moments. John, assigned to a field hospital near Saint-Lô, would sneak away to Jacqueline's family home, a half-demolished chateau where she lived with her grandmother. They communicated through a mix of French, English, and gestures. He taught her to play poker. She taught him to curse in Norman dialect. Nights were spent sharing stories by candlelight. John recounted Brooklyn Dodgers games. Jacqueline described parachuting British airmen to safety. "She was tougher than any soldier I knew," John later wrote. But when she smiled, it was like the war stopped. Love, however, carried risks. The Gestapo had executed Jacqueline's brother for resistance activities, and her family distrusted outsiders, even allies. When her grandmother discovered their romance, she hissed, "You think he'll stay? They all leave." Meanwhile, John's commanding officer warned him against fraternizing, citing army regulations. Yet neither relented. They met in secret, exchanging vows of loyalty over a bottle of pre-war cognac. On November 11, 1944, Armistice Day, John and Jacqueline married in the shell of Sainte Trinité Church in Caen. The ceremony was a mosaic of cultures. American soldiers sang the Star-Spangled Banner. French villagers recited the Marseillaise. Jacqueline wore a dress sewn from parachute silk. John's uniform bore a bloodstain from Omaha Beach. As they exchanged rings, a twisted bullet casing and a silver bracelet, a lone bagpiper played Amazing Grace, a sound Jacqueline called the saddest, most beautiful thing I'd ever heard. After the war, John and Jacqueline settled in Le Havre, helping rebuild the shattered port city. He worked as a doctor. She opened a bakery, using recipes from her grandmother. Their home became a refuge for veterans and orphans, proof that liberation meant more than defeating Nazis, it meant healing. They had 3 children, raised on stories of D-Day and the resistance. Jacqueline's proudest possession was a French Croix de Guerre, awarded posthumously to her brother, which hung above their mantle next to John's Bronze Star. Jacqueline died in 2015, John in 2020. Their letters, donated to the Caen Memorial Museum, reveal a love that transcended war. "You asked me why I stayed," Jacqueline wrote in 1946, "because you reminded me that the world could still be kind, and because kindness, like courage, is contagious." Theirs was not just a romance. It was a rebellion against hatred, a quiet victory in the long fight for freedom. June 12, 1944. In the village of Sainte-Colombe, just days after liberation, a 19-year-old Frenchwoman named Marie Lefebvre was dragged into a barn by 3 American soldiers. What followed, a brutal assault that left her hospitalized, was not an isolated incident. While the world celebrated freedom, a darker narrative unfolded in the shadows of Normandy. Rape, theft, and violence committed by the very soldiers hailed as liberators. These crimes, long obscured by triumphalist histories, revealed the complex, often painful reality of occupation and liberation. The chaos of war created opportunities for predation. Drunken soldiers, emboldened by victory and separated from home, sometimes turned on the civilians they'd sworn to protect. In Cherbourg, a military police report noted 17 rapes in a single week. In Carentan, a GI was arrested for assaulting a 14-year-old girl. French police logs recorded over 300 sexual assaults by Allied troops in Normandy between June and August 1944, a fraction of the true toll, as shame and fear silenced many victims. General Dwight Eisenhower, aware that misconduct could alienate French allies, issued strict orders. Soldiers who commit crimes against civilians will face swift justice. By July 1944, the US Army had established 135 court-martial tribunals in Normandy. Punishments ranged from dishonorable discharges to death. One infamous case involved Private Louis Till, a black soldier accused of raping 2 women in Le Havre. Despite questionable evidence, he was executed by hanging, a verdict criticized as racially motivated. In contrast, white soldiers often received lighter sentences, exposing the era's systemic racism. To deter crime, the military staged public executions. On August 25, 1944, near Falaise, 3 American soldiers convicted of rape and murder were hanged before a crowd of troops and villagers. A chaplain read their crimes aloud as the trapdoor opened. "This is what happens to those who betray the uniform," barked the presiding officer. Yet these spectacles did little to stem the violence. For survivors, liberation became synonymous with betrayal. Colette Dubois, attacked by Canadian soldiers in Caen, later wrote, "They freed us from the Germans, only to make us prisoners of our own fear." Many victims never spoke of their ordeal, burying the pain under decades of silence. Their families too inherited the stigma: a grandmother's unexplained nightmares, a father's sudden rages. Post-war narratives glorified the greatest generation, sidelining stories of Allied misconduct. French authorities, eager to preserve goodwill with their liberators, suppressed reports of crimes. It wasn't until the 1980s that historians like Mary Louise Roberts began excavating these stories, sparking debates about military ethics and collective memory. The rapes and crimes of 1944 force us to confront an uncomfortable truth: no army is monolithic. For every GI who shared his rations, another wielded a weapon against the vulnerable. Yet acknowledging this duality does not diminish the heroism of D-Day. It deepens our understanding of its cost. As historian Anthony Beaver notes, to sanitize war is to dishonor its survivors, both the guilty and the innocent.